Hey, my name is Grady Simmons. I'm 28 years old, and I run a record shop called Static Age Records on Church Street in Burlington, Vermont. The same shop my Uncle Walt built with his own hands back when nobody thought vinyl was coming back. On Sunday nights, I host 2 hours of community radio on WXRB, a show called Side B Sessions, where I play the tracks everybody skips in favor of the single. I've always had a soft spot for the ones that get overlooked. The shop is one long room with a tin ceiling Walt never got around to replacing, bins organized by genre, and then, within genre, by a system only I fully understand, and a front window that catches the afternoon light just right for about 40 minutes a day, which is usually when I do my actual browsing instead of working. It was deep in November, the kind of gray that settles over Lake Champlain for months at a stretch, and business had been exactly as slow as it always is in that stretch between the leaf peepers leaving and the holiday shoppers showing up. The bell over the door gave its usual rattle a little after 4, and I didn't look up right away, because the shop had been slow all day, and I'd learned a long time ago not to get my hopes up about the sound of that bell. I was elbow deep in a crate of records some estate sale had dumped on me that morning, still smelling faintly of a basement, when a voice said, "Please tell me you're still buying, because I have a box in my car and my back can't take carrying it back out." I knew the voice before I looked up. 10 years hadn't changed it enough that I didn't recognize it in half a sentence. When I did look up, she was standing just inside the door in a green wool coat that looked borrowed, holding a cardboard box against her hip like it weighed more than it probably did. Her hair was cut shorter than I remembered, just past her jaw, a little lighter from whatever sun Chicago gets in the fall. Josie Halloran. Standing in my shop like the last 10 years hadn't happened at all. I set down the record I was holding, carefully, the way you'd set down something breakable. "Josie. Grady." She said my name like she was testing whether it would still hold weight. For a second, neither of us moved, and the only sound was the radiator in the back clanking the way it always did, and my phone buzzing under the counter with a text I'd look at later, and the two of us just standing there working out, I think, whether this was actually happening. "You cut your hair." It was the only true, safe thing available to me. "You didn't," she said, and almost smiled. She set the box down on the counter between us, like a peace offering, or maybe a shield. Inside were maybe 30 records, mostly her father's, some Motown, a little folk I recognized from her kitchen table, back when I used to sit there doing homework I wasn't actually doing. My mom's selling the house. She got the words out before I could even ask. She's moving to Portland to be near my brother. I'm here helping her pack, and there is an actual, factual mountain of vinyl in that basement nobody in my family knows what to do with. Somebody told me there was still a record shop on Church Street. I didn't think about it being yours until I was already standing outside the door. "You could have kept walking." I thought about it. She looked at me a second too long, the way you look at something you're deciding whether you're allowed to want. Then she said the thing that undid whatever careful, boring piece I'd built for myself over the last decade. "I heard you asked about me, a long time ago." My mom told me, years after the fact, the way she tells me everything, right when it's the least useful. I felt my face go warm. "I heard about the engagement. It seemed easier to get out in the open than to keep circling it. Saw it in the paper. Congratulations, I guess, though that's about 7 years late." Josie went very still. "I never married him." 3 words. I didn't have a single thing ready to say back. Behind her, through the front window, snow had started coming down in the half-hearted way it does in November, the kind that never quite commits to sticking. And for a second I let myself focus on that instead of her face, because her face had something in it I wasn't ready for yet. I did the only useful thing I could think of, which was turn around and put the kettle on in the back room, because if I stood there looking at her one more second I was going to say something I hadn't thought through yet. 10 years is a strange unit of time to explain to somebody standing 3 feet away from you. We'd been 18 the summer she left. Both of us handed diplomas on the same stage, 2 minutes apart. And I remember standing in the school parking lot afterward while she talked about Chicago, about the program she'd gotten into, the kind of thing you don't turn down. I remember not once asking her to stay, and not once telling her I wanted to come. Walt had just found out his heart wasn't doing what it was supposed to do, and the shop had a lease he couldn't manage alone anymore. And I told myself Josie didn't need to carry any of that, that the kindest thing I could do was let her go be whoever she was going to be without dragging a sick uncle and a failing shop along behind her. What I actually said, standing by her car with her mother waiting behind the wheel, was something closer to, "You should go. You don't need to be waiting around on me," which felt generous at the time, and has mostly just felt like the worst sentence I ever put together in the years since. She wrote to me for a while. "I know that now the way you know a fact you've had a long time to sit with. What I didn't know, standing there with the kettle starting to complain, was how much of the silence after that had actually been mine and not hers." I brought 2 mugs out, mostly needing something to do with my hands, and found Josie crouched by the folk section, running a finger along the spines like she was reading Braille. "You kept the store looking exactly the same," she said. "Same crooked shelf by the register. Walt never fixed that shelf in 30 years. I like it crooked, feels honest." She stood and took the mug I handed her, and for a second our hands were both on it, and neither of us moved to make that stop being true. "I heard about Walt," she said quietly. "I'm sorry. My mom sent flowers. I don't know if you remember that." "I remember. I wanted to write something. I didn't know what to say that wasn't either too much or nowhere near enough, so I didn't say anything, which I've apparently gotten pretty good at over the years. It was the closest either of us had come yet to naming the actual shape of what had happened between us. And I didn't chase it, because some things you don't get to rush just because you've waited 10 years for the door to open again. "How long are you in town?" I asked, because it felt like the safest question and the only one that actually mattered. "Just under 3 weeks. The closing on the house is December 4th, and I'm supposed to be back in Chicago the day after for a presentation I can't move. Just under 3 weeks, and then back to my actual life." She said actual life, the way you'd describe a coat that doesn't fit anymore, but you've stopped noticing, because you've worn it so long. "And the box," I said, nodding at the counter, needing to say something that wasn't about how little time she had left. "Cash or credit? I want you to not lowball me on the Motown. Some of those are in better shape than you're pretending they are." I laughed, actually laughed, for what felt like the first time in the whole conversation, and something in her shoulders came down half an inch when I did. We went through the box together, record by record, and it turned out to be the easiest hour we'd had since she walked in, because sorting vinyl is a task with clear edges, and I think we both badly needed that kind of certainty right then. Near the bottom, under a Sam Cooke record with a cracked sleeve, I found something that wasn't her father's, a 7-inch single, homemade sleeve, hand-lettered in silver paint pen. Salt Hollow, it said. Low tide. I knew exactly what it was before I turned it over, because I'd stood in a basement show with maybe 40 other people the night that band played their last set before breaking up, and I'd bought 2 copies off the drummer for $5 each, and I'd given one of them to Josie for her 18th birthday, 2 weeks before graduation. "That's not my dad's," Josie said, watching my face. "That one's mine. I must have packed it in with the rest by mistake." I held it a second too long. "You still have your copy." It wasn't a question, but she answered it like one. "I have my copy," she said. "I've had it in every apartment I've lived in for 10 years. I've just never once been able to make myself put it on." The kettle had gone cold in both our mugs. Outside, a plow scraped down Church Street, and a couple of college kids laughed their way past the window, and neither of us said anything for a second that felt a lot longer than a second. Same, I said finally, because it was true, and because it was the first completely honest thing I'd managed since the bell rang. She looked at me like that answer had cost her something to hear. Then she checked her phone, and her whole posture changed, some kind of door closing behind her eyes. I have to get back. My mom's expecting me for dinner, she said, already reaching for the box. It was really good to see you, Grady. She was almost to the door before I made myself say the thing. Come back before you go, or don't sell your dad's records to whoever's cheapest at least. I'll give you a fair price and bad coffee. She paused with her hand on the door. Is that an invitation or a business offer? Haven't decided yet. The bell rattled again on her way out, and I stood there in the quiet for a long moment before I went into the back room, past the crates I hadn't sorted yet, and pulled a shoebox down from the top shelf I hadn't touched in years. My own copy of the Salt Hollow single was still inside it, right where I'd put it a decade ago, the homemade sleeve gone soft at the corners. I carried it out to the front and set it on the shelf behind the register, not sure yet what I meant by that, and stood there in the quiet, wondering what exactly I'd just agreed to let back into my life. Nadia noticed before I said a word, which tells you something about how bad I am at hiding things from my own sister. She came in a couple of afternoons later to cover the register while I did inventory in the back, took one look at my face and said, "Who died?" Which is Nadia for "You look like something happened and I need details immediately." Josie Halloran came into the shop. Nadia set down the box cutter she'd been holding like it had suddenly become a liability. The Josie Halloran, high school Josie, the one whose name you haven't said out loud since she left for Chicago Josie. She's selling her mom's records. It was mostly a business thing. Grady, Nadia has 4 years on me in age, and about 40 years on me in reading people, and she just looked at me until I told her the rest, the box, the single, the deadline, all of it, while she rang up a customer's copy of some Otis Redding reissue without breaking eye contact with me once. The second the customer was out the door, Nadia rounded on me. You have to ask her to dinner. Real dinner, not a coffee, not a walk. Dinner, at a table, with a candle if you can manage it without setting the tablecloth on fire. She's leaving in less than 3 weeks. Then you've got less than 3 weeks, which is considerably more than you've given yourself in about a decade, so don't waste it being you about it. I called her that night. Actually called, no texting first to soften the blow, and she picked up on the second ring like she'd been half expecting it. We ended up at a little Italian place on Main a few nights later, a table by the window, and it was easier than I'd braced for, easier than any first anything had been for me in years, honestly, because we already knew the important things about each other, the 10-year gap notwithstanding. She told me about the firm in Chicago, how she'd started out wanting to restore old buildings and had somehow ended up mostly doing compliance reviews for new construction instead. How she hadn't touched an actual historic property in over a year. I told her about Walt, the real version this time, not the sanitized one. How he'd had the stroke 3 years ago while restocking the jazz section. How I'd found him on the floor and thought for 4 of the worst minutes of my life that I'd lost him before I ever got to tell him what the shop meant to me. He survived that morning, but he never really got his strength back, and I lost him for real the following spring. I never asked you to stay for him, Josie said carefully. You didn't stay for him. You decided that on your own, and then told me it was for my benefit. It landed harder than I expected, mostly because it was true, and I'd never once heard it said back to me in those exact words. I was scared, I said. Of what? Of being the reason you didn't become whoever you were supposed to become, of you looking back in 10 years and being disappointed that you picked me over Chicago. Josie was quiet a second, turning her water glass a slow half circle on the table. I didn't need you to be a reason not to go, she said. I needed you to be a reason to come back. Those aren't the same thing, and I don't think you ever figured out the difference. I didn't have an answer for that one either. It was becoming a pattern. The next afternoon, Josie came by while Nadia was covering the register, and I watched the two of them size each other up over a crate of 45s with the kind of instant, wary respect that usually takes people months to earn. By the time I came out from the back, they were already arguing cheerfully over whether a Carole King pressing was worth $12 or $8, and Nadia caught my eye over Josie's shoulder and gave me the smallest possible nod, which from Nadia is roughly equivalent to a standing ovation. A few nights after that, I did something I hadn't done in the 3 years I'd been hosting Side B sessions, which was bring somebody up to the station with me. WXRB runs out of the basement of the old Masonic building, 2 rooms and a hallway that always smells faintly like a church basement coffee hour. And Josie sat across the little table from me with a pair of headphones half on, watching me cue up records like she was trying to memorize the choreography of it. "You've done this every week for 3 years, she said during a song, and nobody ever comes with you?" "Nadia, sometimes. Mostly it's just me and whoever's driving home late enough to be listening to community radio at 10 at night. That's a small audience for something you clearly love this much." It's not really about the audience size. I pulled the next record, an old Gene Clark pressing, and queued it up. It's about the songs that don't get picked. Every album's got a couple tracks nobody requests, the ones that get skipped for the single. I like giving those a room to be in, even if it's a small room. Josie was quiet a second, turning that over. "Is that a metaphor, or are you just talking about music?" "It depends how much you want it to be a metaphor." She laughed and reached over without asking and pulled the next record off my stack, an old soul single I'd been saving for a slow week. She slid it across the table. "Play this one, Side B." I looked at the label, then at her, and something passed between us that didn't need a sentence attached to it. I played it. For 2 hours we sat in that basement room, trading records back and forth, arguing gently about track order, and somewhere in the middle of a long instrumental, she reached over and laced her fingers through mine on the table. Not dramatic about it, just quiet and certain, like she'd done the math and it had come out the way she wanted. Neither of us said anything about it. We didn't need to, not that night. It was, without question, the best 2 hours of Radio Burlington had gotten out of me in 3 years, and not one listener called in to ask why. For a few days after that, it felt like something was actually working itself out. She came by the shop most afternoons after finishing up at her mother's, and we fell into an easy rhythm neither of us mentioned out loud for fear of jinxing it, sorting records, arguing about whether a particular Neil Young pressing was worth what I was charging for it. Walking down to the lake most evenings once the shop went quiet. One evening we sat on the breakwater with our coats zipped to the chin, watching the ferry lights cross toward New York. And Josie leaned her shoulder against mine without any particular announcement about it. "I used to come here after we broke up," she said. "Before I left for good, I'd sit right about here and try to talk myself into being fine." Did it work? Enough to get on a plane, not enough to actually be fine. I didn't have anything smart to say to that, so I put my arm around her, and she let me, and we stayed until the cold finally won and drove us back toward the car. It was the first time since she'd come back that neither of us mentioned the deadline out loud, which felt, somehow, like its own kind of progress. Then one afternoon, while she was sitting on my counter eating a sandwich, her phone rang, and I watched her whole face change when she saw the name on the screen. She stepped outside to take it. I didn't ask, because it wasn't my business yet. But I watched her through the front window pacing the sidewalk for almost 10 minutes, one arm wrapped around herself against the cold, and when she came back in, she wouldn't quite meet my eyes. "Adrian," she said finally, before I could pretend I hadn't been wondering. "He heard through somebody I was back in Vermont. Wanted to, I don't know, check in. Clear the air," he said. Did it get cleared? There wasn't really any air left to clear. I told him that. He didn't love hearing it. She picked at the crust of her sandwich without actually eating any of it. He asked if I was seeing someone here. I told him that wasn't really his business anymore, and he laughed like I'd just confirmed something for him. She didn't say much more about it, and I didn't push, but something had shifted in the room, some small weather change I couldn't name yet. That same night, Nadia mentioned, sort of sideways while we were closing up, that she'd run into Vivian Halloran at the grocery store, and Vivian had said Josie was on the phone with her half the night, going back and forth about whether coming back here at all had been a mistake, whether she was just tired and homesick and filling a gap with something familiar instead of something real. Nadia probably meant it as harmless small talk. It landed on me like a verdict. I spent the next couple of days being, by any honest account, pretty bad company. Short answers, busy with inventory that didn't need doing. When Josie came by again, the way she had most afternoons that week, I was distant enough that even I could feel it happening and couldn't seem to stop it, like watching yourself do something stupid from 3 feet outside your own body. "What's going on with you?" she asked, straightforward, the way she'd always asked things. "Nothing. Busy day." "Grady, I heard you're not sure this is real," I said, before I could stop myself, and immediately regretted the exact shape of it. That maybe it's just easy because it's familiar. Josie went very still, the same stillness from the day she'd told me about Adrian. "Who told you that?" "Does it matter?" "It matters if you're about to use second-hand gossip to talk yourself out of something before I even get a say in it." She wasn't wrong, and I think we both knew it. But I was already too far down the path of protecting myself the only way I knew how, which was getting there first. "Maybe I'm just being realistic. You have a whole life in Chicago. I have a record shop and a radiator that doesn't work right. I'm not going to pretend those are the same size." Josie picked her coat up off the stool without another word and left, and the bell over the door sounded exactly the same as it always did, which somehow made it worse. I didn't hear from her for a couple of days, which is a short amount of time on a calendar, and an unreasonably long amount of time when you've just handed someone a reason to give up on you a second time. I told myself it was fine, that I'd done the smart thing, the protective thing, gotten out ahead of the disappointment, instead of waiting around for it to land on me the way it had 10 years ago. Nadia did not agree with this assessment. She found the Salt Hollow single sitting on the shelf behind the register one morning, right where I'd left it since the day I'd pulled it out of that shoebox, still in its silver-lettered sleeve, still unplayed, and she held it up like evidence at a trial I hadn't known I was standing. "You've had this out here for a week," she said. "Have you played it?" "I've been busy." "You've had it for 10 years, and you've been busy the entire time. Is that the story we're telling now?" I didn't answer, and Nadia set the record down on the counter between us, gently, the way you'd set down something you didn't want to break further than it already was. "You did the exact same thing you did the first time," she said. "She told you something true and scary, and instead of sitting with it, you found the fastest possible exit and called it being realistic. I watched you do it in real time, Grady. I was standing right there, restocking the jazz section." She said she wasn't sure it was real. She said that to her mother, at 2 in the morning, probably scared out of her mind, which is a completely different thing than saying it to your face. You didn't ask her what she meant. You just decided you already knew and left before she could tell you otherwise. I picked up the record. 10 years, and the sleeve wasn't even worn, because I'd handled it maybe twice since the night I put it away in that shoebox, both times just long enough to remember why I couldn't go further. "What if she's right, though?" I said, quieter than I meant to. "What if this is just 2 people filling in a gap that's shaped like each other because it's convenient?" Nadia looked at me a long moment. "Then you'll have actually tried and lost her honestly, instead of losing her because you were too scared to find out. Which one of those sounds more like something you could live with?" I didn't have a good answer to that, so for once I didn't try to find one. Nadia pulled my jacket off the hook by the door and more or less threw it at me. Go, I've got the register. Go be brave somewhere that isn't behind a counter for once in your life. I just got my coat. Vivian Halloran opened the door before I even finished knocking, which told me she'd probably been watching from the window, a habit I remembered from high school, and apparently one that had outlasted an entire decade. Grady Simmons, she said, like she was confirming something to herself more than greeting me. Took you long enough. Is Josie here? Upstairs, sulking, though she'd deny it. Vivian didn't move out of the doorway right away. Before you go up there, I owe you an apology, though I don't imagine you know what for yet. Years ago, when she first thought about calling you, I told her not to chase after a boy who'd let her go so easily. I meant it kindly. It didn't come out kind, and it didn't stay quiet in her head the way I hoped it would. You were trying to protect her. I was trying to protect her from watching her hope get let down twice by the same person, and instead I just made sure it took 10 extra years to happen anyway. Vivian stepped aside to let me pass, then caught my sleeve for half a second before I could get past her. Don't make it 11, Grady. I won't. Go on up, third door. Josie was sitting on the floor of what used to be her childhood bedroom, half-packed boxes around her, holding a photograph I couldn't see the front of yet. The walls still had the faint rectangular ghosts of posters that had come down years before, and a strip of pencil-height marks climbed the doorframe behind her, stopping abruptly somewhere around 15. She didn't look surprised to see me in the doorway, which somehow made it easier and harder at the same time. I brought something, I said, holding up the record, still in its silver-lettered sleeve. I know what you brought. You've been carrying that thing around like it might go off. I think it might. I sat down across from her on the floor. Boxes between us, instead of a counter this time, and for once I didn't reach for the safest available sentence. You were right. 10 years ago, standing in that parking lot, I didn't tell you to go because it was generous. I told you to go because I was terrified that if I asked you to stay, or asked to come with you, you'd say yes out of guilt, and I'd spend the rest of my life knowing I was the reason you never got to find out who you could have been without me. It felt noble at the time. It was actually just fear wearing a nicer coat. Josie set the photograph down, face still turned away from me. And a couple of days ago, I heard one sentence out of context and decided it meant exactly what I was already afraid it meant, instead of asking you. Same fear, different coat. I told my mom I wasn't sure it was real, Josie said quietly. I didn't mean you weren't real. I meant I didn't know if I trusted myself yet, after everything, to know the difference between missing home and actually wanting a specific person in it. That's a scary thing to say out loud to anyone, even your own mother at 2 in the morning. You didn't give me the chance to say it any better than that. I know. I'm sorry. I turned the record over in my hands. I never played side B, not once. I told myself it was because I didn't want to wear it out, and that was a lie I got so good at telling myself I almost believed it. The truth is, I was scared of what I'd feel hearing it, and scared of what it meant that I'd kept it 10 years without ever finding out. Josie reached over, slow, and took the record out of my hands, turning it so the silver lettering caught the last of the light through her old window. There's a note inside the sleeve, she said. I wrote it before I left. I don't know if you ever actually read the whole thing, or just saw enough to know it existed and got scared off. I hadn't. I'll admit that now, though I didn't say it out loud right then, mostly because my throat had gone tight and unreliable. She slid the record halfway out, and there it was, in her 18-year-old handwriting, a little faded, an address in Chicago that hadn't been hers in years, and a few lines underneath it that I read out loud before I could stop myself. This is the address. I'm not asking you to promise anything, Just don't let this one go unplayed." "I meant the record," she said. "Mostly." "I know what you meant." We sat on the floor of her childhood bedroom a long time after that, not saying much, passing the record back and forth between us, like it might break the spell if we set it down. Eventually she told me the rest of it, the parts about Adrian I hadn't asked for, and she hadn't offered before. How he'd been kind enough in the ordinary ways, but had wanted her to take a partner track position that meant giving up the preservation work entirely. How she'd said yes to the ring before she'd fully admitted to herself she'd have to say no to the only part of the job she actually loved. How the engagement had unraveled less over one big fight and more over months of her quietly resenting a life that fit everyone but her. How the real end had come when he'd asked, not unkindly, why she still had unpacked boxes of drafting supplies 8 months into living together, and she hadn't had a real answer for him. How she'd handed the ring back 3 weeks later in a coffee shop parking lot and felt, for the first time in over a year, like she could breathe all the way to the bottom of her lungs. "I've been thinking about going independent, preservation consulting, small buildings, local stuff, the kind of work nobody at my firm wants because there's no money in it. I've been thinking about it for almost a year, and I haven't done a single real thing about it, because it's terrifying to bet on yourself after you've already been wrong once. There's a space 2 doors down from the shop, above the bakery. It's been empty since the framing place closed. I asked Denny about it a few days ago, before any of this, before I even let myself admit why I was asking." Josie looked at me like she was recalculating something. "You asked about office space a few days ago." I told myself it was just in case a good tenant came along. "Grady, I know. It's either the most or the least subtle thing you've ever done, and I genuinely can't decide which." She laughed, actually laughed, the sound of it loosening something in my chest that had been tight since the day the bell first rang. It wasn't a decision made right then, not the whole shape of it anyway. There were still calls to make, and a lease to look at, and a firm in Chicago that deserved more than a text message, but something had shifted that felt more solid than nostalgia, more like 2 people choosing each other on purpose, instead of just falling backward into something familiar because the ground happened to be there. Before I left that night, Vivian caught me on the porch and hugged me, quick and fierce, the way she used to after I'd helped her carry groceries in high school, like no time had passed at all. "Don't you dare let this go quiet again. I mean it, Grady Simmons." I told her I didn't plan on it, and for once in my life, I meant it enough to actually believe myself. I used to think the record shop was full of things other people had let go of, which made me the guy standing around collecting what nobody else wanted anymore. It took Josie walking back through that door to show me the other half of that, which is that nothing anybody ever really loved gets thrown away completely. It just waits on a shelf for the right person to finally drop the needle. On the morning the moving truck came for Vivian's furniture, I drove over before Josie's flight, not with a speech, because I'd used up every good sentence I had on the floor of her old bedroom a couple of days before, but with the record and the spare key to the space above the bakery, which Denny had agreed to hold for 30 days while she decided what she actually wanted, on nothing but my word and a longer conversation than either of us expected. I found her on the porch, one suitcase already by the door, and I held out both hands, the key in one, the record in the other, and let her pick. She took the record first. "There's a turntable in that box by the mailbox," she said, nodding at the one thing Vivian apparently hadn't let the movers touch. "Play the whole side. I'm not going anywhere until it's over."